It's a great delight to invite Liz Carmichael to speak about the work that she has just recently published in this excellent and impressive book, Peacemaking and Peacebuilding in South Africa.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, John, and thanks very much to all of you. I'm going to introduce this book. It's 193,000 words or thereabouts, so I'm not going to be able to introduce very much of it in the next 40 minutes. So this book tells how South Africa's very diverse and divided society descended into violent confrontation between its government and the majority of the population, compounded by grassroots intercommunal violence and low-intensity civil war, and how, despite the apparent impossibilities, the majority of the people across racial barriers never lost the vision of future national unity, and how the people found ways to transcend their divisions and work together to establish a unified multi-party democracy. So it's a story told for the first time in full of the National Peace Accord, the first consensus document. The accord and the work done under it has been easy to overlook, but it is a vital element in South Africa's transition from apartheid to democracy. Negotiated and signed in 1991, the accord was the first broad consensus agreement in the nation's history. In face of chaotic violence, intimidation and mistrust, it aimed to regulate the behaviour of the political parties and the security forces, to investigate, understand and prevent violence and intimidation, and to facilitate relief to victims and initiate socio-economic reconstruction and development where possible. Vitally, the accord was not merely a one-day agreement, which could be deemed to collapse when inevitably violence happened the next day or the next week, but it set up a nationwide structure of peace committees, a comprehensive infrastructure for peace to implement itself. And thousands of people worked through that infrastructure. The signing of the accord in September 1991 opened the way for constitutional negotiations to start in December. And from then on, the two processes proceeded in parallel. That of making and building peace under the accord, on the one hand, and that of devising the new constitution at top political level on the other. The constitutional talks could and did hit difficulties and breakdowns and walkouts, but the peace committees held firm. They grew steadily, and their work never stopped. The peaceful 1994 election was testament to the success of both processes. The peace committees were closed, except in KwaZulu-Natal, where they were kept on for another decade, at the end of 1994, although many thought this premature because much peace building remained to do. An amnesty process was promised under the interim constitution under which the 1994 election was held, and the mechanism for granting amnesty was then worked out after the election, and that was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It built upon the commissions already held in Chile, Guatemala and El Salvador. The form was worked out after the election, and the TRC was appointed in 95 and worked through 1996 to 98. So we have a cascade of events. The release of Mandela, the National Peace Accord, CODESA and the multi-party negotiating forum following it after CODESA had collapsed, the election in April of 1994, and then the TRC as the amnesty process. For this presentation, I thought it most helpful to give you some detail on the background and the nature of the conflicts in South Africa, and then move into a PowerPoint presentation to introduce the Accord and its work. South Africa has a long and complex history. The humanoid fossil record goes back several million years. The first modern humans, about which we know something, were the San, or Bushmen, the slightly built hunter-gatherers who had free run across the whole of southern Africa for at least 50,000 years. Numerous overhanging rocks bear testimony to their art, and the clicks from their language are preserved in several of the present vernaculars. Then about 2,000 years ago, the San were slowly confined to the Kalahari as various different tribal groups of Bantu, cattle-herding farmers, began to migrate southwards from Central Africa and to settle in the northern interior and along the eastern coast, next to the Indian Ocean. By 1000 AD, these groups were smelting and using iron. There was no Bronze Age in South Africa, which is interesting from a British point of view. The Western Cape developed its own distinctive population of pastoralists, now usually known as the Khoi, or Khoisan, who had acquired cattle and were related to the San. Cape Town was the capital of the Western Cape, and originally of the first white colony, the Cape Colony. The first Europeans landed in 1487, a bit further along the coast from Cape Town. This was the Portuguese expedition of Bartholomew Diaz, sent by the King of Portugal to find a new trade route to the Indian Ocean. It took another 200 years before white settlers came, when in 1652, the Dutch East India Company established a vegetable garden here, where Cape Town stands now. The Dutch were quickly joined by French Huguenot refugees, who started a lot of the wine industry, and farmers from Germany. These white groups together formed the Afrikaners, literally Africans. In religion, they were Dutch Reformed Calvinists. They took over the Khoisan pasture lands and imported a large slave population, drawn from Angola. As you went south to the Cape, you could easily buy slaves from the great slaving kingdom of Angola, Congo. From Angola, then from Indonesia and all around the Indian Ocean. And interracial marriage was rare but possible, provided the black partner, who was invariably the woman, was baptized. General racial mixing produced the coloured or mixed-race people, who currently number over 4 million, about 9% of the total South African population. Both the white Afrikaners and the coloured people spoke Afrikaans, a simple form of Dutch. The British first took the Cape Colony from the Dutch in 1795 in order to prevent the French from getting it, and returned permanently in 1814, bringing a liberal, colour-blind constitution, and in the 1830s, the abolition of slavery. In 1820, the British began colonising the Eastern Cape, landing English settlers at what became Port Elizabeth, now called Abertha, which is there. I don't know if you can see the pointer. As they moved north, these English settlers were confronted by the Khoisan inhabitants, resulting in frontier wars, expansion of white control, and the first political prisoners being exiled on Robben Island. Meanwhile, with permission from the Zulu king, in 1824, British traders established a trading post at Durban. Again, I don't know if you can see this little pointer there, at Durban, which became the colony of Natal. The Zulus were a large, warlike tribe, formed by the Zulu chief Shaka, was from 1787 to 1828, who subjugated many smaller clans to create his Zulu kingdom, and gave it, especially among the black population widely, a very warlike reputation. The colony expanded. Britain conquered the Zulus in July of 1879, after famously suffering defeat in the first battle of that year in January at Isandlwana, where the expeditionary force of 1,000 or so made the fatal error of not forming a defensive laager or wagon circle and was virtually wiped out. Thousands of indentured labourers were brought from India to work the Natal sugar plantations. Passenger Indians followed, and Mahatma Gandhi's political formation took place over 20 years in South Africa, 1893 to 1914, defending the civil rights of the Indians as British citizens, and giving the Indian population a special place in South Africa ever after. In the 1830s, many Afrikaner farmers, the Boers, trekked north from the Cape Colony to get away from liberal British rule. Two iconic incidents occurred in 1838. In February, the Zulu king, successor of Shaka, King Dingane, received the trekkers' leader, Piet Retief, and a 100-strong group, but, having asked them to lay aside their arms, treacherously had them killed. So, that December, at the Battle of Blood River, 470 trekkers, protected by their wagon circle laager, defeated a Zulu force of some 15,000. The trekkers had made a covenant with God that if he granted them victory, they would keep that day, 16th December, as an annual remembrance. The victory gave the Afrikaners a national identity. They were now a chosen people, like Israel of old, moving into a land given them by God and given trusteeship of the native peoples. They easily captured the high grass plains of the interior and established the independent republics of the Transvaal and Orange Free State, which you can see on the map. The discovery of gold and diamonds, combined with the European scramble for Africa and the imperial ambitions of Cecil Rhodes, led to the Second South African War, the Boer War, the major war of 1899 to 1902, between these two republics and the British Empire. The Afrikaners fought in fast-moving mounted commandos. The British tactic was scorched earth, to destroy the commandos' support base by burning their farms and forcing their families and servants into concentration camps, where some 27,000 died of disease and starvation. This gave the Afrikaners a burning resentment against the British. The war ended with the Transvaal and Free State becoming British colonies, but with the promise of self-rule within the empire. And the final outcome was the birth, in 1910, of the new country, the Union of South Africa, after talks at a national convention from which all blacks were excluded. The new country was a self-governing dominion with the same status within the British Empire as Australia, New Zealand and Canada. The 4 colonies became the provinces: the Cape, Natal, Transvaal and Orange Free State. The population at that time overall was about 6 million, 1 million being white. This new country was ruled almost entirely by white male voters, who alone could sit in Parliament. This was despite heartfelt protests and representations to Westminster by Western-educated black leaders and white Cape Liberal sympathisers. In the Cape, wealthy, educated black males still enjoyed a qualified franchise, which from 1936 onwards gradually disappeared. White immigration continued, bringing Greeks, famously running corner cafes, Portuguese, and Lithuanian Jews, who became quite important for the liberal community in South Africa. In 1912, black African leaders formed a South African Native Congress, which was renamed in 1923 as the African National Congress, the ANC. It was polite and gentlemanly, loyal to the Crown, and non-violent. An observation made by Walsh in 1969 seems particularly insightful. I quote, "African nationalism in South Africa, with its deep liberal Christian roots, maintained a remarkably steady focus on non-racial ideals." In 1915, Afrikaner nationalism organised itself as the National Party, and during the interwar years, during the ascendancy of fascism, its hardline members developed the overtly racialist policy of apartheid, literally separateness, predicated on white supremacy. But it came as a shock to English-speaking whites and to blacks alike, when in 1948 the National Party took power, winning by just 5 constituency seats, not by a majority of the voters, and began to implement apartheid. Apartheid was institutionalised racism in the starkest sense. So-called petty apartheid meant things like the reservation of the best beaches for whites only, separate amenities of all kinds, separate entrances to post offices, segregated transport, and generally the institutionalisation of the social norms that had previously held the races apart. Interracial sex and marriage involving whites became illegal. Black students, such as Mandela had been, were banned from liberal white universities. So-called grand apartheid was the political project to achieve complete separation, not only between races but even between tribes. Black African South Africans lost their citizenship and were assigned to one of 10 tribal so-called self-governing territories, homelands or Bantustans. These were intended to become independent, but only 4 did so and were not recognised internationally. The object was the elimination of the black population from white South Africa, except as migrant workers. A few blacks benefited, but for most, the policy caused immense suffering and profound resentment. Rigid control was imposed through identity documents or passes, which dictated where any black person over 16 could live and work. Anyone not carrying a valid pass in a white area was liable to arrest, imprisonment or fine, and being endorsed out to a tribal homeland. The police, black and white, enforced the pass laws and thus attracted the black population's disgust and hatred. There was strong international disapproval of apartheid, voiced in the UN, at first the instigation of India, and in the Commonwealth. But South Africa had a geopolitical advantage in that it claimed, right up until the end of the Cold War, to be the bastion of democracy, capitalism and Christianity in Southern Africa. Within the country, militant, multiracial, non-violent protests arose against apartheid. In 1955, the Freedom Charter, a popular manifesto for a non-racial South Africa, was drawn up after wide consultation and adopted by the ANC and others as their manifesto. In 1960, an unarmed crowd protesting against passes outside the police station in the township of Sharpeville, south of Johannesburg, was fired on by the police after many hours of standoff, resulting in 69 deaths and 180 injuries. Protest and international condemnation followed. The ANC, whose leaders now included Nelson Mandela, tried to persuade the government to call a multiracial national convention. Instead, the ANC was banned. The white electorate voted by just 52%, sounds familiar, to become a republic, and South Africa quit the Commonwealth, where it was already a pariah. In 1961, Mandela and other ANC leaders decided that an armed resistance had to be formed, and they formed the armed group Umkhonto weSizwe, MK for short, aiming to act by sabotage and to avoid civilian deaths. Mandela chaired its high command. It included members of the Communist Party, which had been banned since 1950, and for training, it looked to independent Africa and the Communist bloc. MK operations were at first patchy, but they increased, especially in the 1980s. The sabotage convention largely held, and only about 240 deaths are recorded in South Africa due to official MK actions. However, informally trained internal members of MK were responsible for many more deaths during the grassroots violence of the 1980s. The early 1970s saw the height of grand apartheid, with the imposition of the Bantustan policy and the building of vast hostels for migrant workers. But the black population did not disappear from urban areas, and it became apparent gradually that apartheid simply did not work. In 1976, the youth of Soweto rose up in protest against their inferior Bantu education. The confrontation with the police turned violent, and from then on, unrest in the townships became endemic. In the 1980s, the ANC in exile encouraged activists to make the townships ungovernable, and attacks on police and on any perceived informers increased. President Botha adopted the strategy of Andre Beaufort, who was mentioned yesterday, trying to win hearts and minds through a mixture of reform and repression. So he brought in mild constitutional reforms, plus harsh repression and a state of emergency. Both the security police and military intelligence at this stage developed dirty tricks units, and people were disappeared and assassinated. Much of the work of the later TRC referred to this period. The policy merely provoked further anger and resistance. Youths dropped out of school under the slogan, "Liberation now, education later." Young comrades stoned or otherwise lynched those who were identified as police spies or government collaborators. The Zulu homeland, headed by Chief Mangosuthu Buthelezi, looked to the government for support, and a bloody secondary war broke out in Natal, KwaZulu, pitting traditionalist Zulus of Buthelezi's Inkatha movement against ANC-aligned activists. Buthelezi complained that the ANC had an army, while he did not. Hence, in the mid-1980s, South African military intelligence secretly trained some 200 Zulus in security operations, including house clearance, that is, how to kill ANC civilians in their own homes. The training was done in the Caprivi Strip in Namibia. Some Caprivians were then deployed as KwaZulu police, a force like the ANC regarded as Buthelezio's private army. At first, the combatants in the Inkatha ANC war were all Zulu, but in 1990, Inkatha became the Inkatha Freedom Party, aspiring to be a national and open to all political party, and began recruiting in the vast townships around Johannesburg. And here, the violence spread and took on an ethnic colouring. Any Zulu could be labelled an Inkatha spy and attacked simply as Zulu. Mutual retaliatory violence and ethnic cleansing of residential areas set in. People were killed, houses burned, and many of the migrant worker hostels, vast buildings, housing thousands in pretty horrible conditions, already housing a preponderance of Zulus, became Zulu fortresses. Normal law and order was absent. The South African riot police and army could do little more than attempt to remove unlicensed guns from all sides. Partly for that reason, they were perceived by both sides as partial to the other. In fact, they were simply shooting at anyone who shot at them. People lived in fear, and the press and TV provided a daily drip feed of killings. 3 here, 6 here, 26 this week, and it just went on and on. Broadly speaking, South Africa was suffering two major interrelated conflicts. On the one hand, the overall conflict between the majority of the population and the apartheid government, supported by its police and with the army now in the townships backing up the police, and on the other, the bloody grassroots violence between supporters of Inkatha and the ANC. Efforts at peace were being made. At grassroots in the KwaZulu, these were led mainly by the church leaders. At top leadership level, very important clandestine talks were organised during the 1980s by business, British business, between the ANC in exile and influential Afrikaners, and by the government itself and Mandela in prison. And these led to the momentous speech of the 2nd of February 1990 by the new state president, F.W. de Klerk, announcing the unconditional release of Mandela and the unbanning of the liberation movements. 2 results were expected to follow. Mandela would meet with Buthelezi, they would know each other, and the grassroots violence would abate. And multi-party talks about talks would begin, starting the process of devising a new constitution and preparing for the first democratic election. Neither of these results actually happened. For a whole year, Mandela was prevented by ANC hawks from meeting Buthelezi. The hawks wished to give him no recognition whatever. And the only talks that haltingly took place were bilaterals between the ANC and government, all focused on security matters around the return of exiles and further releases of political prisoners, and who was a political prisoner and who wasn't. The crisis point was reached in April-May 1991, when the ANC, blaming the government for both the grassroots violence and continued incidents of police shootings, threatened to pull out of all talks. The churches and business had meanwhile each, separately, prepared themselves to offer help on a united basis to the transition process. And at this point, a group of church and business leaders formed, including Desmond Tutu, and came forward as facilitators. The facilitators managed to insert themselves into the political process. Between them, they had the influence and the contacts to bring together representatives of the main parties, ANC, government and IFP, which had been incapable of getting themselves together, and a wide range of others, only accepting the far right, which had nothing to do with anything that had to do with the ANC and communism. It was all a communist plot. At a brilliantly facilitated meeting about peace on the 22nd of June 1991 at a corporate headquarters in Johannesburg, all parties agreed to negotiate a set of peace agreements to be signed as soon as possible by all the top leaders. And these agreements became the chapters of the National Peace Accord. So this is the pickle we're in. Nelson Mandela is released. The liberation movements are unbanned and become, or act as, political parties. The Zulu cultural movement in Carter also becomes actually a political party, trying to position itself for the expected talks. But low-intensity war between the ANC and IFP, which had started in the 1980s in Natal, now spreads to the big townships around the reef, around Johannesburg, the Gold Reef. This is a typical press photo, in fact, of Alexandra during a several-day battle with the police, and the youth are trying to build little barricades across the streets. There's tear gas, there's stones, there's bullets. And other violence is occurring due to right-wing groups, which also level bombs from time to time, and homeland governments. And there is a complete failure of the main leaders to begin constitutional talks. So enter the 12 facilitators. It's a longish story, but I don't have time, so please look at the book. So we have left to right, Johan Haynes, a very leading member of the Dutch Reformed Church with great influence in the government. No Alberts, scientific advisor to the government, but also a well-known Dutch Reformed layman, mandated by de Klerk to get this group together, although they were already together, but that was the official mandate. Then John Hall, head of Barlow Land Group, director of Barlow Land. Frank Chikane of the South African Council of Churches, regarded as very liberal and communist by the right wing. Bobby Godsall of Anglo-American. Jabu Mabuza, Black Business. Kotso Ngorjo, leading church leader from Natal. Ray Macaulay, he brought in the Pentecostalists, white Pentecostalists mainly, who are again important behind the scenes politically. Desmond Tutu, Kelly Lupper, who represented the interfaith aspect. Sean Cleary, a mediator, previously a diplomat, who had set up his own NGO and had been involved in peace talks in Natal. And finally Sam Motswanyane, again African business. So they're looking pretty pleased with themselves. It's just before they're having this meeting from 2 p.m. to 10 p.m. with all the political leaders. A lot of thinking had been done before this, and as I said, this meeting was brilliantly facilitated. It brought together the ideas that people had, it sorted them out, and it set up a preparatory committee, which itself would set up working groups to negotiate what became the National Peace Accord. And 3 months later, after 3 months of work, about 4 months of waiting, this appeared. It's the National Peace Accord. It is a little booklet of 33 pages, 9 short chapters, and it has these things in it. A preamble, a declaration of the purpose of the signatories to end political violence. Principles, which begins with the establishment of a multi-party democracy in South Africa is our common goal. The first time this was stated by a completely wide group in South Africa. Then it has a code of conduct for political parties and organisations, and this little 3-page code of conduct was absolutely key for the peace committees. We could hand it out and say, your leaders have signed this, and it said things like, having a preamble on fundamental rights and the importance of democratic parties. All political parties and organisations shall actively contribute to the creation of a climate of democratic tolerance by publicly and repeatedly condemning political violence and encouraging among their followers an understanding of the importance of democratic pluralism and a culture of political tolerance, and acting positively also vis-à-vis all public authorities, including local and traditional authorities, to support the right of all political parties and organisations to have reasonable freedom of access to their members, supporters and other persons in rural and urban areas, whether they be housed on public or private property. So no intimidation and preventing people going to meetings and attacking rallies and so on. There's more, obviously, and very importantly, there is the undertaking to ensure that the appropriate authorities, and it came to other parties as well, are properly informed of the date, place, duration and where applicable routing of each public meeting, rally, march or other event organised by the party or organisation. A lot of violence was happening around rallies, marches and of course funerals. And that gave the opening for combined, united planning and control of such events, and literally thousands of them were planned and monitored through the peace accord period, pretty much eliminating that kind of violence. So quickly moving on, then chapter 3 was general provisions for the security forces, and these were all sorts of little and big agreements about the behaviour of the police and the setting up of institutional means of controlling that behaviour. And then a police code of conduct, which is an aspirational, I will be a good policeman. And measures to facilitate socio-economic reconstruction and development, which enabled the peace committees to start thinking about community-based development as well as reconstructing after obvious violence. Then the Commission of Inquiry, the Goldstone Commission, which prefigured the TRC in many ways, and that had been legislated for already and it became useful by being incorporated into the Accord. And then a National Peace Secretariat, which had the official responsibility for setting up regional and local regional dispute resolution committees, as they were at first called. They were then renamed peace committees, and each region could set up as many, thank you, 5 minutes, as many local peace committees as were needed. And on these committees, very importantly, civil society sat, as well as the politicians and the security forces. And in fact, civil society, in the form of churches, business and lawyers, provided much of the leadership of the chairing, the facilitation and the training of the peace committees. The National Peace Committee presided over the whole thing. It was not statutory, as the Peace Secretariat was statutory, so that people who didn't want to relate to any government statutory body could still relate to the National Peace Committee, and it was the fount of consensus authority and legitimacy. Then chapters about enforcing the peace agreement, which really came down to shaming the people who transgressed the code, and that actually worked. And the leaders, it took about 2 years, but the leaders, Mandela, Buthelezi, began to admit that actually their members were responsible for some of the violence. And special criminal courts, and that was replaced by a regulation which speeded up political cases in the Roman courts. This is the National Peace Convention, the magic word, convention, to bring South Africa together. And this is the day of the signing of the National Peace Accord. From morning when there were lots of Zulu warriors dancing around outside, to some people's distress, till the evening, which was a cocktail party up on the roof, attended by some 400 people, including press and diplomatic representatives and so on. Tutu and de Klerk saying hello at the beginning of the convention. Some of the, the signatures, that 23 people signed for 29 organisations. You can see on the side away from me, there are the 3 signatures of de Klerk, Mandela and Buthelezi. And there they all are, de Klerk, Mandela, Buthelezi, laughing at a joke told by Desmond Tutu before he led the final prayer, I'm sure. And that's the only time they ever sat together like that. Here are the structures. So we've got, stemming from the Accord, the National Peace Committee, and its subcommittees for socio-economic reconstruction and development and publicity, which was huge. National Peace Secretariat looking after the regions, and the Training Committee, composed mainly of lawyers who had done alternative dispute resolution, and then the Goldstone Commission, and the Police Board, which is an important think tank on police reform and training. And the structures evolved a bit over time. And the country was divided into 11 regions under the Peace Accord, so 11 regional peace committees. That's monitoring on the ground. And the local peace committees were able really to keep tabs on what was happening and to move quickly and adaptively. Local Peace Committee formed on the 1st of April 1992. We're now into September. We've got a handle on the violence. We've got all the parties into the committee actively, and we've got a weekend away, looking at the vision for that particular township, Alexandra, and how do we get there. Christmas party. In Carter Elder on the left, the very good Army Brigadier in the middle, and ANC on the right. The early publicity, there was a very effective TV advert there as well, the 2 hands first pointing at each other as if they were shooting, and then clasping each other, to dramatic music. And then in 1993, this really did take the country by storm, the peace doves. And that became the insignia of the peace structures as well. And it was carried by peace monitors. And this is an example of making sure that violence does not break out. Again, here's only Carter Group being monitored. Previously that was the ANC. Peace Day was huge. People got involved in doing things for peace all over the country. 2nd of September 1993, it was a kind of pre-run for the election days. So the police getting involved. Peace walkers going out to Durban. Peace soccer in Natal. Bloemfontein, of all places. Bloemfontein for peace. And peace is cool. This was the winning picture in a newspaper competition. Monitors before the election. A typical unit, although we posed it later and they don't have their radios. We've deployed 18,500 monitors throughout the election days of '94, and here are more in Soweto with the Methodist Bishop Peter Story in the middle. And that's about it, folks.